All right, welcome everyone to the Forum for Law, Ethics, and Society. Today we have our very privileged to have Damien Williams, and he is from the University, Virginia Tech. I was going to say something wrong there, Virginia Tech, and he's just one of the people studying currently on how technology affects race and privilege, and also he does work on disability studies as well, which is very interesting and fascinating. So super excited to hear from him today. We, as usual, you will be able to put questions in the questions and answer, and we will pick through those, pick some of the best questions and have those answered live. And then right around 1 o'clock, we will stop the formal presentation and then do informal question and answers for those of you who can stay. Otherwise, that will be a time when you can leave if you're part of the Philosophy 205 class. All right, so thank you very much, Damon, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And I'll check back in with you as questions arise later in the talk. So take it away, Damien. Do you have the share slide function?
Yeah, I am pulling that up as we speak.
Okay, great.
There we are. All right. First of all, thank you all for having me today. I really appreciate it. I want to specifically thank Dr. Sullins for inviting me to be here today. It's a great honor to be able to talk to you all about this. The first thing we're going to really do is just kind of go through a few slides, kind of loosely give a history and a background on the nature of a number of different technological systems and social technical contexts in which these systems have come to exist and the ways that they kind of permeate our lives. So the talk that I'm giving today is called Do Black Lives Matter to Technology? On the medicalization, datafication, and surveillance objectification of Blackness. I will unpack all of those terms as we go through. One of the things that we kind of have to start by understanding is that for a large portion of the United States, the history of policing, the history of carceral justice has its roots in slavery and slave patrols. So while it is the case that a lot of United States policing was imported from the old world, England and Europe, in the form of the constabulary, in the form of night watch, in the form of other kinds of guard patrols, a large portion of what we think of today in terms of the policing apparatus of the United States depends upon the retrieval, the punishment, and the re-incarceration of enslaved African peoples. Histories have shown that specifically throughout the South, but also within the North, there are direct ties between the recapturing of escaped slaves and posses of white individuals, landowners, slave owners, those working for slave owners, and those who then would be recaptured, resold perhaps, or in many ways punished and further abducted for the sake of enslavement. These developed into sheriff patrols. They developed alongside of, in later years after slavery was abolished, the Ku Klux Klan and the history of posses and lynch mobs. Much of that history persisted directly into the United States and through the United States. And I just kind of want to have that as the background, even as we kind of unpack the other kind of surveillance technologies that we're going to be talking about today. One of the fundamental things that we also have to be thinking about is the history of photography. When I talk about the term surveillance objectification, what I mean in that is that this notion of who is made to be subject to being watched. And how is their being made to be subject constructed? How is it conceived of? How is it materially composed in the world? In the United States, in the West, one of the ways in which surveillance is conducted, one of the primary ways, is video surveillance, photography, facial recognition, live actual video, moving video as well. But in order to understand what this is and how it operates within this context, we have to recognize that the history of photography is, in fact, itself in many ways racially charged. The history of photography kind of depends upon this notion of what can be seen and how it can be seen. Photography being developed in, as we know of it, being developed in the 1900s, focused primarily on images of white, wealthy, landowning, in most part landowning, or at the very least, moderately wealthy white individuals. Therefore, the techniques, the tools, the processes by which photography was made to function all depended upon and were geared towards making certain that those white individuals were able to see themselves as clearly as possible in the photographs that were rendered. As time went on, the tools and techniques that were then developed in order to make sure that the detail of white individuals were seen clearly, the facial details, the eyes, the mouth, the nose, the shading, the contrast to their background were all as clear as possible, became thought of as simply the way of things. They became assumed background conditions of what it meant to do photography. However, those processes were not necessarily and did not have to necessarily be the only way that photography could have been constructed. It is simply a set of choices that were made based on the social conditions in which photography was developed. Those choices persisted to the point that in the 1940s and 50s, Kodak, Eastman Kodak, the camera company and the film imaging company, one of the primary producers of film and the pioneers in photographic technology at the time, developed what were known as Shirley cards. Shirley cards were literally a picture of a white woman named Shirley in different colored outfits against different colored backgrounds. And these cards were designed to help photographers better calibrate all of their photographic equipment, such that the white woman named Shirley could be more clearly seen in all of these photographs. The process of white balancing, of finding the brightest point in the room, was thereby made this kind of assumed portion of what it meant to do photography. The gauging of lumens or units of light was the foundation of photographic technology in a way that it didn't necessarily have to be. Other tools and other techniques were possible, but it became the assumed, it became the norm. As we will see as we continue on, this persists even today in digital imaging technologies. And one of the things that you might be able to notice already, I've kind of done on purpose here today, and I'll point it out to you later on. The nature of photographic imaging also depends upon the nature of the perception of, and feeds into the perception of, how Black people or people with darker skin tones are seen and understood and rendered in the world today. In the majority of images of Black people, they are, especially in the 1900s and early 20th century, they are rendered as almost indistinguishable dark shapes. They are generally perceived to be less real, less defined, less fully human. This perception is not only the fault of photography, but it is made real and visible by early photography and photography as it continues to exist. But that perception is a psychological perception. That perception of Black people as more imposing, as less real, as less human, less detailed, more monolithic, is one that has been sociologically and psychologically inscribed throughout the history of Black people's enslavement and their incarcerations within the United States, to the point that there are certain basic psychological features that have imprinted themselves and are measurable by psychologists who have shown that Black people, and specifically Black children, are read as older than they are. Here we have a couple of headlines and a couple of quotes from the cases of Michael Brown and Tamir Rice, who were shot and killed by police. Police who saw these children as very, very large, as much older than they were, as more deadly, more dangerous than they were. The quote from Darren Wilson, who killed Michael Brown, says, "When I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan." Wilson is 6'4" and 210 pounds. Michael Brown was 6'4" and 292 pounds at the time of his death. Now, that is a difference of 82 pounds, but it is not the difference of anything more than trying to lift perhaps a piece of furniture that is a little bit large for you, something any one of us who's had to help somebody move house knows how to do. And certainly someone who is supposedly trained in how to subdue and deal with an individual, an unruly individual, should know how to and should be able to make happen. From the killing of Tamir Rice, Cleveland officer says that, quote, "Didn't know it was a kid." Now, when the call that ultimately led to Tamir Rice's death was called in, it was called in as a man with a gun in a park. Yeah, someone said that there was a man waving a gun around in a park. Tamir Rice is a 12-year-old child, and he was perceived as immediately a threat because he was a Black child with a toy gun. This then colored and permeated the responses, the perceptions of the officers who responded to the call, such that when they saw what they saw, they perceived it as an older individual with a gun that was then definitely and immediately a threat to them. Black children being read as older has other effects as well. Young Black boys are read as more threatening. Young Black girls are read as hypersexualized. There's a 2014 study called The Essence of Innocence, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which digs into this kind of wide-ranging study, which shows when people, specifically white people, are presented with images of Black children, they roughly 80% of the time, if not more often, read those children as older. Threat matrices are then applied subconsciously, most likely, sometimes consciously, to the people who are read as older than they actually are. Sarah Ahmed in The Cultural Politics of Emotion puts it this way. Some bodies are, quote, in an instant, unquote, judged as suspicious or as dangerous, as objects to be feared, a judgment that can have lethal consequences. There can be nothing more dangerous to a body than the social agreement that that body is dangerous. So what we've talked about so far is the fact that fundamentally, the history of policing is in many ways founded in a history of enslavement and carcerality of Black peoples. These people are seen as capable of being enslaved because they were traditionally shown as less than human. They were argued to be not really fully human beings and thus worthy of enslavement. If they're not really human in the same way that a white body is, then that body can be enslaved. If they're not fully human, if they are bestial in a way that a white body is not, then they can be treated more harshly. If they are bestial in a way that a white body is not, they are more dangerous, more likely to go quote unquote feral. That means they must be dealt with more harshly. That means they must always be on guard against for being a potential threat. The inscription of this perception, this objectification of the black body, of blackness within peoples who had been enslaved and rendered as less than human, translates as well then into the way that photographic images translate those bodies. Those perceptions are then reinforced by the photographic technology, which has thus rendered them as less clear, less detailed, less human, less real than the white people who are subject in those same images. These perceptions reinforce the tools and technologies that we use to perceive the world, and the output of the tools and the technologies that we use to perceive and interact with the world reinforces the perceptions. So what happens when the social agreement about the body is turned into data? When it's not just a set of perceptions and a set of happenstance that gets rendered into tools and techniques, but it is turned into mathematical, quote unquote, objective data on which new decisions, policies are rendered, part of which we've already seen. But the fact of the matter is that the datafication of Black bodies has a much longer history than just technologies such as photography, than the 20th and 21st century interaction of Black people with the police. The datafication of Black bodies goes back as long as Black bodies have been made subject to white enslavement and white medicalization and scientific scrutiny. So here we have a couple of different things. We have at the top left a chart from phrenological examinations. Phrenology is a discounted science which was used to say that certain constructions of skull shape, certain constructions of brain pan size, and the distance between the eyes, the nose, and the brow, the forehead, were all capable of telling us something about the character of a human being, what type of person they were, whether they were a criminal, whether they were intelligent, whether they were likely to go on to live a long, full life as a shoemaker, any number of things were said to be able to be discerned by the shape of and the interactions and interrelations between the features on a human being's skull. As you can see on this chart, the white Roman statuesque face is at the top. And then that structure then goes down to what is almost a full caricature of an African slave skull, and then from there to an orangutan. The comparison between Black people and apes was reinscribed and reinforced when Darwin's understanding of evolution and the chain of being gained popularity. People began to use the notion that human beings descended from monkeys, a misconstrual, an oversimplification, but a popular one. They began to use this to say, well, if that's the case, then Black people must very obviously be much more recently descended from monkeys than white people. And so they are less human. They are more animalistic. Now, phrenology and physiognomy, its overarching cousin, have both been wildly discredited, right? They have been thrown out in the dustpan of scientific history, except that they haven't really been. Other components have survived. The questions of whether we can know something about a person by the shape of their face, whether we can tell intent, whether we can use biometric data to know something about what a person is like, still persists to this day and is sold widely by facial recognition and artificial intelligence and algorithmic data companies. This history stretches back to not just the shape of someone's face and the shape of their skull. It stretches into what we believed a human body's capabilities were, what we believed Black people were capable of doing, and what we thought that that meant. The notion in the history of spirometry, breath science, persists to this day. But the history of spirometry is one that is overarchingly filled with racist assumptions about what it meant for a human being to be able to have a specific type of physiological capacities. Misconceptions that Black people were more animalistic and thus would have different types of lung capacity, would literally breathe differently, founded in many ways the history and the science of breath. The notion of Black people's physiological responses to stimulus, to pain, still to this day color the treatment that Black people get in hospitals. Black people are often believed to feel pain differently than white people. That is, they are fundamentally gauged to feel differently than white people are. A study as recently as 2017 shows that doctors in the Pacific Northwest have these underlying beliefs that the physiological responses that Black people have to pain, pleasure, neurological stimulus are different than white people's. That means that when a Black person tells them that their pain level is an 8 on a scale of pain from 1 to 10, the white doctor is less likely to believe them and is likely to incorrectly note or to alter in their files the recorded pain level of the Black patient, saying that what that person is feeling must not be the case. Now, one could say that this is just a case of simple individualized racism, but unfortunately, that's just not the case. This is the data that gets used to train new generations of doctors. These are the standards, the expectations, the overarching belief systems and values that get passed down from one set of experts to another. They get translated then into the new tools that get used, such that algorithmic data turns into this kind of repository for misconceptions about Black people's medical experiences. That is, tools such as artificial intelligence, algorithmic data sorting, machine learning, take these misreported, miscoded pieces of data and use them to deliver expectations, to deliver recommendations about Black people's health that are going to then be fundamentally wrong and can thus lead to life and death consequences. This is not individualized, this is systemic. And the history of the systemic sets of prejudice, again, goes back hundreds of years. You can read about the history of spirometry in Lundy Braun's Breathing Race into the Machine. You can read about the history of physiometry in Seaworth et al.'s Physiognomy. Melissa Stein has a great book on on measuring manhood. There's Harriet Washington's, I didn't put her names up on the screen here, but Harriet Washington has a book called Medical Apartheid, which talks very clearly about the history of the different levels of medical treatment that Black and white people get, both in the United States and in Europe. Within medical apartheid, we have the story of Saartjie Burnett, was called by many the quote unquote Hottentot Venus. She was studied against her will, without her consent, and experimented upon by people who were trying to develop new tools of gynecological science. That is, they were trying to better understand how women's frameworks at the time differed from men's. People with wombs and people with vulvas and people with vaginas, people with uteruses and fallopian tubes, how did they operate? Which at one point, because those people were far less likely to actually receive good medical care themselves, was a thing that was widely unknown. In order to know more about it, They used what was literally a captive populace to study and experiment to gather data. The history of this is well documented and is in many cases fundamentally horrific. Black people's bodies throughout history have been fundamentally objectified, medicalized, and datafied, turned into data on which new systems, new tools, and new technologies are trained. Simultaneously, those very same Black people's bodies, their responses, their experiences, their spoken responses to what is happening to them are ignored, misconstrued, and misrepresented. The perception of what is happening to Black people within their medicalization, within their datafication, has been 100% throughout history designed by people who didn't want to listen to Black people. This has further repercussions even today, not to get too far off track in some of the things we're talking about here, but it has further repercussions today when you think about why certain populations of people don't trust the medical establishment, why certain populations don't want to go to a doctor, why they don't want to necessarily spend time there. It persisted not just in the 19th and 20th century, but throughout the 20th century. Talk about the history of the Tuskegee trials. Talk about places in Mississippi and Alabama who were given injections against their will, told that they were vaccinations, but in many cases were simply nothing, just to see how people responded, to see what would happen. Black populations, fundamentally and primarily throughout history, subject to medical experimentation against their will. The datafication and subjectification of Black people persists today in facial recognition technologies. We talk about the history of what photography is, and we talk about the fact that photography sees Black people less well. We talk about facial recognition, we're talking about the fact that facial recognition technology, the tools that are supposed to be able to match people to images and data about them within large-scale systems, algorithmic systems, artificial intelligence systems, fundamentally don't recognize Black people very well at all. Reports from the ACLU and WNYC have shown that Amazon's facial recognition system provides false matches when presented with Black and brown individuals more often by far than it does when presented with white individuals. Darker the skin tone, the more likely to represent a false match. Fundamentally, this is because facial recognition and digital photography are outgrowths of photography, which, once again, does not see Black people and darker skin tones very well. The GIF here is a gentleman saying, "I'm Black. I think my Blackness is interfering with the computer's ability to follow me." In 2009, there was a fairly famous incident at this point of Hewlett Packard producing a facial recognition camera, which was supposed to keep in the center of frame any individual who was making use of a computer at a given time and making use of video conferencing equipment. It would track you wherever your face was if you were white. There's a video on YouTube, you can go take a look at it, of this gentleman and his colleague. They work at a computer store, they're demonstrating this, this camera. They show that the people who have much, much lighter skin tones, who put themselves in front of the camera, easily tracked, easily followed by the camera. And the people who have darker skin tones, such as himself, are not. Wherever he moves, the camera stays fully wherever it was before he moved. Does not follow him at all. Facial recognition technology fundamentally sees Black people less well. And it sees Black people less well because it is trained on data which, once again, does not have the ability to distinguish well between the features of Black and brown individuals. Digital camera technology is an outgrowth of analog camera technology. Changes that were made in order to develop digital cameras were choices that were seeking to, as best as possible, replicate the outputs of analog cameras. The goal was to make sure, at first, that people who made use of a digital camera had as seamless an experience as possible moving from an analog camera to a digital camera. That means that the white balance in the process of trying to find the brightest spot in the room and make clear renderings of it was absolutely primary, and one of the first things that was sought to be clarified and rectified within digital camera technology. Here's the part where I tell you about the thing that I did on purpose. What is the brightest thing in the frame and image of me right now? It's this. In order to focus on my face, I have to tilt the camera up, and then it blows my shirt out completely. If I tilt my camera down, even a quarter of an inch, what will happen is that my shirt, my chest, will become absolutely perfectly clear. My face, still entirely in frame, will become pretty muddied, much further darkened. Just as an example. You can still distinguish my features, but the thing that you can see much more clearly and is no longer blown out and glowing like the sun is my shirt. Now, this is not to say that somebody intentionally said, let's make sure that Black people can't be seen on camera. This is not to say that someone intentionally said, let's make sure that when we make digital camera photography, the people that will have the hardest time making sure that they are seen in a frame are Black people. It is to say, however, that certain assumptions and certain choices were made and were inscribed within camera technology, which were then reinforced, layered upon, overarchingly engaged over and over again. And the choices that then get made then become assumptions, become thought of as simply the way things are. Lumens are not the only way to judge and to render photography. And with the advent of digital photography, even less so. We can use measurement of infrared, we can use heat mapping, we can use any number of things to render clearer and better images. But lumens are the standard. Lumens were the standard because lumens were the best way to measure the reflectivity, measure against the reflectivity of white skin. Regimes of surveillance in the United States are overarchingly used to monitor the behavior of individuals, to watch and learn about, to measure against what people are doing. They are used for the sake of carceral justice, most often, crime, statistics, making sure that certain people aren't causing trouble. But who is most often surveilled? Well, as you might have guessed, the most often surveilled are Black and brown populations in the United States. The most often assumed to be criminal, most often put under surveillance, are Black and brown populations within the United States. In a 2016 report from Claire Garvey and a host of her colleagues at Georgetown Center for Privacy and Technology, it's called the Perpetual Lineup. The 2016 report says, an FBI co-authored study suggests that facial recognition may be less accurate on Black people. Also, due to disproportionately high arrest rates, systems that rely on those databases likely include a disproportionate number of African Americans. Despite these findings, there's no independent testing regime for racially biased error rates. In interviews, 2 major face recognition companies admitted that they did not run these tests internally either. Face recognition, therefore, may be least accurate for those it is most likely to affect, African Americans. Breaking that down, that is to say, the majority of facial recognition databases are trained on images from people who don't have a say in what their images get used on. For a large period of time, that was arrest rates, that was mugshots. Mugshot data trained what a face looked like. If an image in a mugshot is clear, it will be better able to be rendered by the database and recognize the face. If an image in a mugshot database is unclear, it will match to its nearest neighbor. Who's the most likely to be clear and who's the most likely to be unclear in photography, as we have discussed thus far? Thus, being most often deployed within a neighborhood, that is, having a larger foundation of data on which to train, does not necessarily equal a clearer, more accurate representation of who ought to be, quote unquote, ought to be surveilled. The people who are most likely to be watched, most likely to be monitored for criminal behavior, most likely to be suspected of criminal behavior, are the people that will be seen less well by the systems and the people doing the monitoring. They will be likely to be perceived as criminal and to be misperceived as someone they aren't more often. The notion of fitting the description of a Black person, usually a young Black male, being seen as fitting the description of a criminal, and that being used as pretense to accost, to arrest, to restrain, to potentially even kill that individual, is well known within this country at this point. That history persists and is replicated in and by algorithmic surveillance systems. Now, I say that the majority of the history of algorithmic surveillance and facial recognition systems are trained on mugshot data. That is, they're trained on populations who don't have a say in what gets done with their images. But that's no longer necessarily the case. There's a whole host of us, actually, who don't have a say in what gets done with our images, or rather, we give that say away. Clearview AI is a company which scrapes image data from Facebook, Instagram, and other publicly available image sources, and then uses that to train its facial recognition data. Clearview does this and says that it has the right to do this under the First Amendment, and that it does this and has the right to do this because it is nominally a partner with Facebook, and Facebook reserves the right to share your images with whomever they please. Once that option is given away, it is exceedingly difficult to, in any way, shape, or form, take it back. Clearview makes use of this currently, and they still exist to this day. Many have tried to challenge it, but it gets tied up in litigation very often, and the process of trying to actually figure out how to make these changes is extraordinarily difficult. The history of surveillance and the perception of who is seen as a criminal goes back, once again, to the history of enslaved Black and brown individuals being seen as less than human and being necessarily criminal just by trying to escape to freedom. But it also comes a bit more recently. When you think about the history of carceral surveillance in the United States, think about the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Huey Newton. These are people who were surveilled by the United States, who were put under watch, who were assumed to be dangerous, and made subject to a system known as COINTELPRO, it's the counterintelligence program. And COINTELPRO is this kind of basic history, this human history of surveilling Black and brown populations. You can talk about the history of this and find more about the history of this in Simone Brown's fantastic 2015 book, Dark Matters. Again, you can take a look at the perpetual lineup. It exists in there as well. The institutional bias of these systems, the way that these things tend to interact, plays out today in things like not just facial recognition, but algorithmic bail sorting, artificial intelligence used to determine who gets bail and for what reason. Assumptions of criminality of Black and brown individuals results in those people being given less often bail or lower sentencing. Here you can take a look at a gentleman named Bernard Parker on the left, 1 prior offense, resisting arrest without violence, 0 subsequent offenses, rated by the Compass algorithm in Broward County, Florida, as high risk. On the right, Dylan Fugit, 1 prior offense for attempted burglary, 3 subsequent offenses for drug possession, rated low risk by the same algorithm. The only thing that was different, you can take a look at the Compass algorithm at the ProPublica website. They have a full breakdown of it. You can look at their full database metric, 300 different data points. The only thing materially different that would result in a high risk for a guy with 1 offense and 0 subsequent offenses, and a guy with 1 offense, 3 subsequent offenses, is race. These biases play out long term. They are overarchingly embedded, and again, inscribed and reinscribed, reinforced by the systems that get trained on them. Human prejudices made real and made permanent within technological systems. And that's not the only place. We've talked about algorithms, we've talked about photography, we talk about Google search, we can talk about the fact that AI that go through resume sorting think that Black names are less pleasant than white names, that they're less likely to be qualified for a job if a quote unquote Black sounding name is on the top of a resume with the exact same credentials as a quote unquote white sounding name. That person will not be hired. If a quote unquote Black sounding name is attached to the exact same resume as a quote unquote white sounding name, the difference being that one of them has a criminal history and the white sounding name has a criminal history and the Black sounding name doesn't, the white sounding name will still get the job over the Black sounding name without a criminal history. The way that Google search feeds you responses, the way that that ties into the ad data, the way that it ties into your location data, the way that it ties into the searches that other people around you have made, all of these things are fed by human perceptions, human values that get reinscribed into technological systems. And it goes so far even as healthcare. Healthcare AI, once again, taking data that is oftentimes misconstrued, misapplied, misreported, and returning far lower levels of care to Black patients than to white patients. So what do we do about all this? We've talked here at great length about an extensive history and wide-ranging effects of technosocial interactions in which anti-Black prejudice gets reinscribed into technological systems. So what do we do about it? The first and foremost thing that we do about it is we recognize it. We search for it. We name it, and we seek to dismantle it. Knowing that these technologies are so often developed out of stereotypical or otherwise biased data, and thus map least well onto the Black populations and communities and other communities of color when they're most often used, we have to be deeply critical of the idea that the solution to this problem is just greater inclusion, more diversity. As we already saw, more diversity and greater inclusion still turns into less accurate outputs. Indeed, as others like Ruha Benjamin and Safia Noble have suggested, there might simply just be some technologies which are at their core unjust. And if that's the case, then we absolutely must articulate, grapple with, and dismantle the roots and branches of these fundamental justices, or they will recur in ever shinier and newer packages. There are resources by which to do this grappling. This list I can make available to you, these things that we've talked about, the articles and the papers, the case studies that we've looked at, they're all out there. And thinking these tools can help us to better prepare ourselves when we encounter them. I have a new paper that comes out talking about all of this, just came out last night, in fact. It's called Fitting the Description, Historical and Socio-Technical Elements of Facial Recognition and Anti-Black Surveillance. I can make that available to you all through Dr. Sullins, and If you ever want to talk about more of this any point again on today, absolutely happy to do it with you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for that. That was fascinating as always. I've seen this talk a couple of different times, and it's always insightful. So I've got a number of questions here from the audience. So let's work our way through these and see where the conversation takes us. So Avery asks, is this connected to the same way young Black girls are sexualized and adultified to be fast or promiscuous at younger age than others?
Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. The same set of perceptions that makes people read young Black boys as older and more dangerous, as larger, as less human or demonic. The same kind of things can apply to the quote unquote fastness of young girls, young Black girls read as older than they are, more sexually available than they are, even at ages as young as 8, 9, and 10 years old. That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, it's really troubling.
Yeah.
So Abby would like to know, and I think this is interesting. We have a lot of students in the audience. Give us a little background about what your major is and how you wound up studying this particular topic.
Yeah. So my background is I started off in undergrad. I did philosophy and religious studies, and thinking in terms of the way that human belief systems and human values kind of intersect with what humans know, what they claim to know, what they claim to be able to think about the world, and the way that the things that people value and believe shape the things that they will then accept as true and real. I've always had an interest in technology, artificial intelligence, human biotechnological interventions, all those kinds of things. And as I kind of went from undergrad and grad school, I kind of then started to delve deeper into that when I got into my professional life, when I was teaching and presenting at conferences. Started to talk more about how those things kind of even impact things like artificial intelligence, the way that people's values and beliefs impact the artificially intelligent agents that they make and that they create. I kind of came back to grad school because of a conference at which I met Dr. Sullins and my now advisor, Ashley Shue, in 2016, when we were all kind of sitting down and talking about these ideas of how do the values, the beliefs, the morals that we approach these systems with impact the world that we then create, the tools that we create, the outputs of these systems. And so I'm now at Virginia Tech. I'm in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. And STS and philosophy of technology are the way that I kind of get to spend time out in the world talking about these things, right? Like the questions of what are the social conditions of the tools that we make, what are the beliefs of the people who make them, and how do those things impact what they make, and the questions of, well, what are the metaphysical implications, what are the ethical implications, the moral implications when we do make those things, when we engage them, when we put them in context with each other in the communities and the societies that we are trying to live in and build together. All of those things kind of bring me to this topic.
Excellent. Yeah, and just a quick shout out, anybody at Sonoma State that's interested in pursuing a field like this, just drop by my office hours on Zoom, and I will explain to you how you wind up at a place like Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
All right. So another question, this one's from an anonymous attendee, which is interesting. Do Black children being read as older, does that, is that, do you also see evidence that Black women get read as men, as Black men?
So one of the things that kind of happens in that space is this notion of so these assumptions of and essentializations of gender, right? Like what it means to be a Black man and a Black woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to have a gender and have that kind of imposed or inscribed on you, definitely then does have impacts to the way that Black people are read and understood. So Black women are often called or read as mannish, in that space. And you see this in a lot of attacks that get leveled by far right extremists against people like Michelle Obama. You see that as being one of the things that kind of gets levied at Venus and Serena Williams, especially like any athlete who displays talent and poise. That kind of capability is read as likelihood of being then less quote unquote feminine, less truly feminine in the minds of these people. And that again, this comes down to it's a very tangled mess, right? Like this notion that there is such a thing as an essential gender, that there is such a thing as an essentialized manliness or masculinity or womanhood, femininity, and that then can be toggled on and off or slid between by displaying certain types of characteristics, physiological characteristics, all of which then, elides and kind of invalidates the real, true lived experience of gender nonconforming individuals, intersex individuals who have an experience of being both of these things, neither of these things, some, some unquantifiable combination of these things, but not seeing themselves as essentially, truly, quote unquote, truly any one or the other of them.
Right. I can imagine that's where the real crux of the problem would all come together in a really painful way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So Danny asks, if there were more accurate descriptions from callers who are reporting crimes, I suppose, to the police, would that decrease the chance of police murdering suspects?
I mean, a case could be forwarded that might be true, but evidence shows that no matter how accurate the description is, the police response to a Black individual is one of heightened threat response, pretty much always, regardless of situation, regardless of whether that person is armed. There's even evidence that the response that one might show that to try to de-escalate a situation can result in that police officer or other authority figure being reprimanded for not responding with an appropriate level of violence, quote unquote appropriate in that sentence, level of violence. Police officers have been fired for not, responding with deadly force to someone who posed no threat. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that a clearer description on the part of the callers is going to do it. I think it's about the perception and the threat matrix perception on the part of the responders.
Excellent. So Trent asks an interesting question. He says, like how the false science of different races' skull shapes reveals superiority, and the misinformation of the quote curse of Ham that was spread in the U.S. to justify slavery. Do you think modern reasoning for racism could arise? Like, is there a way around this scientifically, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, those reasonings and those justifications, the curse of Ham, haven't gone away, right? Like
right.
that belief that Black people are somehow less human still persists to this day. I think, unfortunately, that one of the things that has happened is that those assumptions and those beliefs have been kind of subjectified or rather sublimated under these calls for saying that data is objective, right? Like this, if I can mathematically measure it, if I can quote unquote prove it to you that these types of people are more likely to be criminal or these types of people are more likely to be violent, if I can say, look, I have all of this data I collected from all of these neighborhoods that I surveilled, and all of these people who get arrested tend to be Black people, that means Black people are more likely to be criminal, never accounting for the fact that your construction of the experiment presupposes the surveillance of Black people on the suspicion of criminality, right? So this notion, this assumption is so embedded and so unconsciously woven into the question of how we gather this data and how we construct the things that we even think to measure in the first place, that it's still woven in and through everything that gets constructed as a result. The main thing is not, can it be? Will it be?
Right.
subjected to or reinscribed in science and tech. It's how do we make it not?
Hmm.
How do we unpack all of those assumptions thoroughly enough? How do we name and dismantle and deconstruct that line of thinking well enough to keep it from reinscribing itself in the tech and the systems that we make?
Right, and I think that's the deeper part of this discussion that might take some of the audience digging deeper into this. We've been reading Race After Technology in my philosophy technology course, and it's really interesting how when you try to just fix things with technology,
Yep.
you tend to just reinscribe something else, right? It's this. Maybe we can wind up the talk last couple of minutes with that, because we have a question here from an anonymous attendee that says, so are you saying I assume the technologies cover things up about Black lives, push Black lives to the background, right? Like the camera does.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions like that. So I think people need a little more clarity on that, if you could.
So I think, yes, one of the fundamental things is that basically the experiences that people have, right? The experiential knowledge, the things that you learn from being alive and existing in the world, the way that you are alive and the way that you exist in the world. That is information, that is knowledge. And that knowledge and that information can be turned into data. It can be made into something that can then train or build a system. A system can be made to recognize, but it has to be understood as such first. The question of whether Black lives have been kind of pushed to the background, of whether they've hidden the, the experience of what it means to be a Black person in the world, in many ways, yes, but in many ways, what they do is highlight the experience. What they do is exacerbate the experience of what it means to be Black in the world, in the United States specifically, right? So in many ways, what we're talking about here is, it's not that the lived experience isn't real, it's that the lived experience is said to be unimportant. It's said to be less meaningful than the data, which kind of overrides that lived experience. That is, when a Black person tells you that they are more likely to be subject to police persecution and oppression, that then says, someone can come back with, per capita, perhaps, but on the whole, raw data says that white people are more often subject to police action. And while that's literally true, it's because there are more white people in the United States than there are Black people, right? The experience of being Black, the experience of being oppressed, being targeted, being made subject to these kind of surveillance technologies, these datafications, this medicalization, this being made an object to be studied, being made subject to the technologies that then study us and make our lives mean something in policy or technology or science other than we would have it, is simultaneously to say your experience doesn't count. But as that has literally been our experience as a people since we were enslaved and brought to the United States, it is to make as real and concrete as possible, to make, again, shiny and new,
Yeah.
fast and datafied, the experience of what it means to be a Black person in the United States.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have one last minute, and I have a very big question. So let's see what you can do with it. I think it's an important one, though. What can we as students do to change this racist malpractice in the medical field? I'll shorten this. The student goes on to say that they notice this still in medical books today, that what you were talking about in the lecture. So this is scary, and how are we going to erase this from medical practice?
That's a very, very important question. And fundamentally, the first and foremost thing that kind of permeates through all of what I'm talking about here today, and especially this, is believe people about the experiences they're telling you they have. Listen when, train people to believe people's reported experience. So much of this is, this tension between expertise and lived experience, as though lived experience were not itself a kind of expertise. There's something to be said, obviously, for training. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be in a PhD program. There's something to be said for, as well, though, the fact that when I have an experience within my own body, and I may not know how to, specifically name and tag it, but I might be able to, describe it to you as something troubling, a pain that I'm having, an unsettled feeling, a sense of wrongness that I'm having, that rather than dismissing me, rather than, not heeding me because I'm not trained in the way that you are, or because you expect my pain levels and my representation of experience to be different than I'm telling you that it is, or because I am perhaps what you consider to be overweight, or because I am a person who you would consider to be less trustworthy on their own lived experience, as many doctors do to women and non-binary people in the world. Rather than that, believe me, fundamentally ask what I think I need. Try to clarify, try to help me find the words, try to help the patient find the words. Advocate for this amongst your professors, advocate for this, interrogate it anytime you're given someone who says, well, sometimes the patient doesn't know what they're talking about, so best to just treat them how you would treat them and let it go. Ask why that's the standard. Ask the question of, well, what about the person's lived experience and what they might be feeling, and why that doesn't matter as much.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much. We will now give you our silent applause, and thank you so much for coming. We will leave the feed going, and people can stick around and talk with Damien if they'd like. We'll deal with a couple more questions. Otherwise, I'll see the rest of you next week.
Thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody wants to speak live, just hit hit the raise hand function, and we'll give you the mic. But until then, let's deal with this question from Dana. It's fascinating that Google has such a strong influence on our thoughts. I've heard that Google results vary for individuals just based on your location. Do you think Google has an existing formula for presenting more or less racially stirring searches results towards the African American audience exclusively to prompt change, or instead strengthen racial indifference?
I don't know if they are that granular. That's not to say I don't think that they could be that granular. I think that they can very easily, like the depth and breadth of Google's tools and capabilities is vast. They could very easily be that granular. I don't know that they are. The documentation on Google's own website and much of the investigations that I and others have done into looking at how Google search works doesn't show that level of applied granularity, though. But again, so much of this is difficult to even really dig into because Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, all of these companies claim proprietary control over the algorithms that they use and say that they can't give away their trade secrets because it puts them in a vulnerable position. And that reasoning has been more or less validated by the United States Congress and the court system. So what that means is that we don't get the opportunity to dig down into how this is actually being used. We have to reverse engineer a large portion of it and take them at their word when they tell us how their search operates. Now, reverse engineering how it operates and reverse engineering and taking them at their word with what they say is they search and correlate by a couple of different things, several things, but a couple of major things that are the main influence. One is ad data, advertising partners that have paid to have their search results put into the top of your feed and they're marked with ads. Didn't always used to be. You didn't always used to say ad on the side there, but they do now.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, where you are. You can go into your Google settings and you can turn off the amount of location data that it uses to correlate your searches. You cannot turn it off entirely. You used to be able to. You cannot anymore. So what it's doing fundamentally is taking the types of searches that other people in your geographic region have done. And that can be down to as granular as your zip code. And now, if you know anything about the history of redlining and the history of gerrymandering in the United States, you know that zip code can very easily be used as a proxy for race by many different companies. So while they don't necessarily say, I'm gonna target all Black people everywhere with these kinds of search results, what they can do is shape the kinds of search results that are more likely to get fed to people within a certain zip code. And they lay this out as kind of the fundamental just baseline of how Google search operates, right? If you don't go in and you don't change it, then you just get the same kind of results that people in your neighborhood get. That's not a bad thing, right? That's just how it works. You know, if you're looking for a restaurant, the people in your neighborhood are probably looking for the same kind of restaurant. Here's those searches in your neighborhood. But it can also lead to the kinds of things that we saw in the wake of Dylan Roof's killings in South Carolina. As the investigation into who Dylan Roof was and what he was doing kind of went on, one of the things that kind of came out was that he had done a Google search for Black on white crime. And this was in the wake of the George Zimmerman prosecution or failure of prosecution, the Trayvon Martin killing. And he did a search on Black and white crime in what was at the time for him rural South Carolina. Dylan Roof was a high school dropout. He was not super familiar with technology. I'm not able to say with 100% certainty, but I would give it a 98% likelihood, did not know how to go into Google settings and change his searches such that he did not just get the same search results as other people in his neighborhood got. And if he's in rural South Carolina searching Black on white crime, one of the things he was very likely to get was responses from paid advertising partners such as Stormfront, the white supremacist community website who, in fact, pays Google to serve its ads to certain geographic areas. Stormfront also manipulates statistics to say exactly the kind of things that we talked about before. Stuff like, well, the majority of crime in the United States is, Black on Black crime. That's not true. Like, Black on Black crime comprises the majority of crime that happens to Black people, but white on white crime comprises the majority of crime that happens to white people. Black on white crime is not really a thing, and it's definitely not a thing when you ask, well, what about white on Black crime? These things are all kind of twisted and made into the statistics that then Stormfront uses to perpetuate its white supremacist hate agenda. Mm-hmm. They, again, though, can serve their ads to people in rural Southern communities, and they target their ads in those ways. Mm-hmm. If that was the kind of thing that Dylan Roof saw first, if that was the rabbit hole that he started to go down, and he himself said that that's the kind of thing that he encountered, those are the kind of statistics that he started to really dig down on, that started to make him feel particular kinds of ways towards Black people, that's the case, then it is fundamentally the case that because of the way that Google serves ads, because of the way that Google arranges its search results, Dylan Roof was more likely to be exposed to white supremacist propaganda that would send him down a path that maybe he wouldn't have gone down, but he would have been less likely to have gone down had he not seen all of that information in that context at that time. Now, he might still have ended up a white supremacist. He might even have still gone on to kill people, but the fact of what he saw, when he saw it, and how he saw it matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good answer, and it's part of what is making social media so hard to root this problem out of, because it's so granular. It's not like a broadcasting media where Stormfront buys 15 minutes a minute long commercial in the in the Super Bowl.
Right.
It's really granular, like it's very hard to root out.
Yeah.
Which brings us to this really interesting question that Trent asks: in an age where companies try to show off their progressiveness, why are companies not trying to fix racist issues in their software? Is it due to those who make the tech or those who own the companies?
That's a very good question. I would kind of push back a little bit, and I would say that there are companies who are trying to make inroads at fixing these problems. However, the reactionary nature of those trying to fix it is still in the, oh no, something went wrong with our tech, and before we get hit with a suit, let's go ahead and try to change it and, you know, show people that we're trying to make amends. That reactionary nature is itself a condition of the values that are being held by the people who make these tools, right? So ultimately, that question is the answer to that question is a little bit of both. There are the people that make it, the people that use it, the way that it gets deployed out into the world, and then what happens when people try to pinpoint exactly where something went wrong, is that a company will try to defer and offload the blame from itself and say, well, it's not us, it's the tool. It's not us, it's the algorithm. It's not us, it's just what the data said. The machine learning system learned from the data we gave it. It's not our fault that it put out a prejudicial, biased, etc. output, except that machine learning learns from what you give it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you know that your data set is problematic at best, when you know that the historical status of these systems is, and the training data that you might be able to use here is in many ways prejudicial, biased, racist, sexist, etc., you can, in fact, take steps to correct for that, to monitor the output, and to feed back into the system correctional metrics. If you don't do that, that's a problem. A colleague of mine and John's, Joanna Bryson, was a co-author on a paper, talked about how this happens in the system Word2Vec. The semantics derived from language corpora display gender bias. I can't remember the exact wording on it, but basically the idea is that if you have a machine learning system that is trained on a large scale trove of conversational natural language data, it's gonna display gendered bias. And others have gone on to show that that's true for racial bias and other forms of human prejudice. If you train a natural language system on a very large amount, the largest available amount of natural language data, what you're going to get is a pretty gross output. And that's because the training system for the majority of those natural language systems is a set of emails traded between partners at Enron.
Mm-hmm.
These were literally millions of lines of conversational emails that were made publicly available as part of the discovery process of the Enron lawsuit. As Enron was being prosecuted, as all of this entered into public domain discovery, and people went, hey, conversational emails like this are hard to come by, and being able to let people, have people just let you dig into their emails, that's really hard. You got to get all kinds of release forms, but this is a set of emails that are publicly available, natural conversation style, back and forth engagement, that are free to use, don't have to get anybody's permission. They're in the public domain. Scrape them for data. Well, I don't know if y'all heard, but the guys that run Enron aren't exactly great people. Mm-hmm. So the way that they talk in the emails that they share with each other isn't exactly great. And so the systems that were developed out of these kinds of conversations took on those modes of conversations, those associations, those inherent biases in the people who were having these conversations. Got fed into the system, reinscribed, and put out as machine learning natural language software. When you break it down, it's not a surprise. It's not inevitable. It could have been otherwise. But because nobody took the steps to make it otherwise, the fact that it turned out like this is kind of predictable.
Yeah, essentially we're making, turning AI into tech bros.
Right.
And yeah, and we're going to get what you would expect from that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it looks like you inadvertently answered Madeline's question. She was asking about machine learning and how do these biases come from exposure to current online interaction. So yeah, you touched on this data set, but of course there's like Microsoft Tay, which tries to use interaction with the system to build its database as well, and that went horribly wrong as well.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Yeah, so Tay was the first time that Microsoft tried to make a conversational AI chatbot, and they put Tay out into the world, and Tay was designed to just engage with people, learn from people, have a conversation with people, and develop new ways of talking to people. They put Tay on Twitter and just kind of let it run loose. Within about 24 hours, Tay was spouting racist, sexist, and deeply, deeply anti-Semitic nonsense. Very cogently spouting it, but spouting it. Like, it was able to construct some of the things that you would see in the depths of the chans. You know, like it was terrible. And it's because they programmed it very well to learn conversational modes, but they put absolutely positively no restrictions or corrections on what it learned and how it deployed it. Later, literally almost exactly 1 year later, Microsoft came out with Zoe. And they did the same thing, and the same thing happened. Like, literally the exact same thing. Like they had learned nothing and were then surprised when, again, less than 24 hours later, this conversational chatbot is spouting bigoted nonsense, is able to very cogently form conversational strings of bigoted nonsense. So yeah, like the question of what does the system learn from? How does it gain the capability to interact with people matters a great deal here, because what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. And if you're putting in, in the same way that the old saying goes, garbage in, garbage out, but it's not just going to be a clearly recognizable transformation of garbage, right? One of the things that happens in algorithmic machine learning is that the system corrects, the system adjusts, the system tries to get to the idealized output that you have given it as its target. And so as you try, as the system tries to get to that idealized target, it makes changes. And sometimes the changes that it makes and the outputs that it generates are shocking and surprising to us. And they are shocking and surprising to the general public even more so, because we don't have the capability, again, of digging down into these systems. They are labeled as proprietary. They are black boxed in a way that we don't get to have access to. We are told you put in an input on one side and you get an output on the other, and that's all you get to know. And but everything that happens, yeah.
Right. And if you do get to know, then you have to sign an NDA and you don't get to talk about it.
Precisely that. The one kind of place where this can be undone is if a state or locality has open records laws. So the reason that we can dig down into the Broward County algorithm is that Broward County, Florida has open records laws. which means that you get to know anything that happens in a courtroom in Broward County.
Mm-hmm.
You get to know what was said, you get to know how a judge ruled, you get to know the reasoning behind the judge, you get to know what was written, you get to know what the precedents, if there were, if it was a regional, like a tribunal, you get to know if there was a dissent on the bench, you get to know everything about it, right?
Yeah.
So Broward County, Florida is a great test case anytime one of these systems gets used.
Mm-hmm.
However, they are one locality amongst myriad within the United States.
Mm-hmm.
One of the places that this shows up, and we mentioned this at the top of our conversation today, is disabilities. Disability benefits algorithms are proprietarily sealed, and the ACLU has had to sue to gain access to disability benefits algorithms on behalf of disabled people whose benefits were modified or cut with no material change in the status or the reporting of status of the disabled individual in question. The algorithm used weighted some input differently at one time than it did at another time.
Yeah.
And that was opaque to the user,
Mm-hmm.
completely hidden. And that's life and death stuff.
Yeah.
Like that's literally whether you get an in-home care nurse, whether you get enough money to buy food, whether you get the ability to make sure that your parents who are living with you and are your in-home caretakers can actually like pay their mortgage. Like that's massive stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was completely blocked out from a general user being able to know what was going on or how these determinations were being made. There's actually a report that came out today from the Georgetown, like it was a disability studies group in Georgetown, and this digging into all of the different ways that disabled people, their advocates have had to kind of request and demand access to the algorithms and the machine learning tools that get used to make these determinations. And so, yeah, like this question of like, where does this come from and how is it known? In some cases, it's intentionally hidden. And you have to go through all of this Byzantine bureaucracy in order to just know, no, how was this decision made? Just tell me how you got from A to C. Tell me what B was.
Mm-hmm.
And I can then like adjust my, my thinking about what is happening here such that it won't happen again.
Right. So this brings up a question that Robert had, which is, do you think that open source projects and decentralization may help decrease prejudice in technology? So I think this would be a good time to maybe throw in a shout out to Algorithmic Justice League and other voices like that.
Yeah, no, the work being done by Algorithmic Justice League, the work being done by Data for Black Lives. There's groups like AI Now. Like there's a whole host of people who are doing work on open source AI projects, open source algorithm projects, but also are trying to do work on like advocacy and policy direction for these systems. Some work is being done at like policy think tanks like New America Institute, just trying to get a handle on all of the myriad ways that the AI that's being created, whether it's open source, private sector, or public sector, whether it's being deployed, or rather how it's being deployed and the ways in which it's actually impacting people's lives. So yeah, I think that that's definitely a major step. I think it's crucial that people are given more access to how these systems function, that they're able to dig in and learn more about how these systems function. But at the same time, it's also the case that if that's still then just going to be taken up by some group and deployed in an opaque way again, if it's going to be, taken and used by somebody whose values are not necessarily concerned with recognizing the prejudicial of the systems that they might be deploying based on how they train it, how they construct it, in what context it's operating, all of these things that are only very recently being thought of as important considerations at all. Like some of the groups that I just mentioned have only existed for about 3 years.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like the real fundamental digging into the question of how do our values impact the technological systems that we make, and specifically the algorithmic and artificial intelligence systems that we make, that's been being done for decades, right? Like people have been researching this question since the 60s and 70s, digging down in it in the field of philosophy of technology, in the field of, science technology studies. But like that being seriously considered and taken up within machine learning communities, within AI communities, within policymaking communities, that's very recent. And so, again, while I think that this is an important component of what needs to happen, even more so is this realization that the values of who's using them, how they're using them, who's tweaking them, who's training them, who's constructing them, who's commissioning them to be constructed in the first place. These values matter to a high degree. They are vastly important. And so when we consider who's doing an open source project, that part matters. Who is it? And for what?
Yeah, not all open source is the same. And
Exactly.
and then there's also, when we get into this part of the discussion, I always want to remind people that competition is real, and big corporations have more
Yes.
resources, time, and energy to
Yes.
put towards these. And while open source projects are wonderful and are to be encouraged, we can't necessarily assume that they're going to save the day.
Right.
In the face of the massive capitalization of corporations and their ability to just create projects that open source people could never have even considered, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like, unless you get extraordinarily lucky, you're extraordinarily well placed, extraordinarily privileged to have the right kind of connections.
Mm-hmm.
Your open source project could very easily be overwhelmed, overlooked, and left in the dust by, Google's next innovation in machine learning.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
I was actually, this is kind of a tangent, but like many of us were actually shocked when Alphabet, Google, divested themselves of Boston Dynamics.
Yeah.
Because it had seemed like it was going to be the foundation of so much of their AI work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, basically when they bought Boston Dynamics, I was like, oh, they're actually taking seriously the question of, well, how does embodiment and a physical presence affect an artificial intelligence and its ability to learn? And it's like they were there for about 3 years and then were like, no, never mind. We're going to focus on machine learning again. So that was a little weird.
Very. Yeah, it seems like a huge mistake, and from my point of view as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I think that there are many different paths, obviously, to think about algorithms, machine learning, machine intelligence systems, but so much of how we get there and what the tech giants decide to do colors the field and shapes the parameters of what will be investigated, what people will dig into, because that's where the money is. If Google and Facebook are in, machine learning outputs, that's where the big money is going to be. And if you can build something that Facebook wants to buy from you, that's where you're going to try to go. If you can build something that Google wants to buy from you, that's where you're going to try to go. And if you can build something that can, miracle of miracles, compete with either one of them and get you a government contract, that's where you're going to go. But they shape the terms and the conditions of what, you know, the wider field of investigation will be for the most part. Like you can try to push back against that. You can try to, you know, make changes and go a different way. But again, if you're trying to go your own way, that can be all well and good, but you're not necessarily going to get noticed. You're not going to make an impact if the, you know, if you're an open source dev team and, you know, Microsoft's over here focusing on something that seems materially the fundamental opposite of what it is you're trying to build.
Excellent. All right. Well, we've been going for an hour and a half now, and I think that's good. And we have of course solved every single one of these problems.
Yes,
Congratulations on
absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. I thank you all again so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This was a fantastic opportunity, and it was a really great chance to talk to all of you. Your questions were really great. I really appreciate it. So thank
Yes,
you so
thank you
much.
very much. Yeah,